Protests against vaccine mandates have led to hostile confrontations at hospitals, restaurants, and shopping malls. So too have the clearing of homeless encampments. Both types of protests mean a police presence. Do they and should they get the same policing approach? We'll hear from three voices tonight. First up, in the provincial capital, in the Chinatown, Kensington neighborhood, there's lawyer Karima Saad, who practices criminal and landlord-tenant law and has been witnessing some of what's gone on firsthand. And Karima, first of all, let's welcome you back to TVO. It's good to see you again. Do I have this right that you have been out there with your video recorder taking pictures of some of the demonstrations over the last few weeks?
That's exactly right. It's been over the past few months, actually.
And how come? Why are you doing it?
It started out of just a curiosity, and my office is proximate to where these protests were happening. And the more I looked into it and observed, the more troubled I was by what I was seeing. And so it became kind of a compulsion to document what I saw happening outside.
Now, these are the anti-vax demonstrations. What did you find problematic about it that you felt you needed to chronicle?
There's a lot of imagery and symbolism that evokes Nazism and references to apartheid, segregation, things that don't really match, in my view, what is happening with public health mandates. And the more I looked into it, there seemed to be groups, particularly white nationalist groups, that are using the cover of the pandemic to, let's say, bring new people into their ranks.
So you think they're using the pandemic to pursue a different agenda that has actually not much to do with public health? Do I have that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay. Let's take some little look-see here at some pictures that you shot. I guess this is a little over a week ago at the Eaton Centre in downtown Toronto, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would. Okay, to the average observer, Karima, that looks like a bit of a demonstration that is perhaps on the verge of getting a little bit out of hand. What are you seeing there, though, that goes beyond that?
I'm seeing people trying to force their way into the Eaton Centre. And in so doing, there are assaults on security guards, assaults on police, and really just a general recklessness for public health and safety. And this was one of the escalations that I've observed. So over the past few months, it's ranged from yelling at strangers on the street to the occasional physical confrontation. And that escalation is concerning.
Now, you just used the word assault to describe what you saw. That's a legal term. Do you know if, in fact, anybody was charged with assault on that occasion?
There were at least 2 people charged with assault. But if we look closely at the video, I think that there are a few more who could have received charges. And I'm not one to call for heavy-handed police action. But I think that the police response overall to anti-vax demonstrations has emboldened the protesters. And, I'll use the word escalation again, because I think that that's what we're seeing.
Okay, you better follow up on that, because are you suggesting that the police's behavior, that the way that they have responded to the anti-vax protests has in fact encouraged them to get more violent?
I think that that's a possibility. I think that there are various factors and variables at play. But if we compare some of the police response to the anti-vax protests versus behavior in other situations, such as encampments, I think that there's a very clear difference, and it's something that needs to be looked at. And even speaking to police officers during these anti-vax protests, it really tended to be a hands-off approach. We respect the right to protest, which is not inherently a problematic thing. But again, the discrepancy in treatment, I think, is something that has emboldened people. And, to follow that up with the fact that there are organizations purporting to represent active and retired police officers in opposition to public health mandates. And the overall tone within the movement, coming from personalities in the anti-vax movement, is the police are on our side. And there haven't really been any strong statements or rebuttals to that suggestion.
Okay, let's be really super clear about what you're alleging here, because if I understand what you're saying that the police tend to be much harsher and more violent when, for example, they're clearing a homeless encampment in a public park versus the indulgence you believe they're showing to the anti-vax protesters. And you're saying they're doing that because in their hearts they support what the anti-vaxxers are doing? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know that I would make that particular allegation. I think that certainly there are police officers who sympathize with anti-vaxxers more than they do homeless people. And I think that that's fair to say, just comparing how the situations have been handled. Is it possible that there is a directive not to engage in these crowds because there's a fear that that will prompt more violence and escalation? Quite possibly. So I don't pretend to understand the rationale behind the tactical approach that's being used. But to an observer, it certainly seems that the anti-vaxxers believe police are on their side.
But I'm also hearing in that answer, you are allowing for the possibility that there may be an alternative explanation here as well.
I think there's always room for multiple explanations, and I think many things can be true at once.
In which case, if you wanted to see a more consistent, in your view, approach to whether it's dealing with homeless encampments or anti-vax protesters, what do you think, hearkening back to that imagery we saw outside the Eaton Center, how do you think the police should have handled that differently from the way they actually did handle it?
I think prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so the event that took place where that video was recorded was something that was advertised quite far in advance. And the main speaker, the keynote, if you will, is Chris Sakosha, who is now, I think, on his 8th bail. And so the fact that there was possibility for, I think, exactly what we saw, an explosive reaction and quite possibly an incitement to this behavior, that's something that police could and maybe should have taken more seriously and prevented that from sort of spilling over. Because, were there permits issued to block off Yonge Street? It's not typical to be able to park right outside Yonge and Dundas Square without being ticketed. So is there something different about these protests that don't warrant designated protest areas or some other form of enforcement that isn't putting the public at risk?
If he's on his 8th bail, though, that suggests that the courts think that there's not that much to this, right? Fair to say?
I think it's fair to say that the courts have assessed that, given all of our constitutional principles at play, release is the fair option. And so I am not questioning the decision to grant him bail, but the pattern of behavior that we've seen makes this maybe not an unpredictable outcome.
But bottom line, in our last 30 seconds here, you'd like to see, in your view, what would be a more consistent approach to policing regardless of the circumstances. Have we got that right?
I think consistency is key. And I also think that, the guiding principle should be protecting the public and how we construe community safety. Safety for who, at whose expense? Those are the questions we should be asking.
Gotcha. Kareem Assad, thanks for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views on this. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we should also say that we did reach out to Toronto Police Services for a representative to contribute to this discussion tonight. Apparently nobody was available, but they did send us this statement, and I'll read part of the statement here. Toronto Police Services says, when there is a threat to public or officer safety, police will use their discretion to disperse the crowd, to make arrests, or to issue tickets. The service also may continue to investigate and make arrests or lay charges after an event has concluded because it may not have been safe to do so during it. With regard to the recent demonstrations on Hospital Row, police were on scene to ensure emergency vehicles were not impeded and there was no obstruction or harassment. That from Toronto Police Services. Let's get a different take on this issue now. Joining us from Kelowna, British Columbia, Rob Ferrer. He is Regional Director of the National Police Federation. That's the union that represents the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And we are delighted to welcome you, Rob Ferrer, to TVO tonight. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Just great, thanks. When you look at the way that your members enforce the anti-vaccination demonstrations that have been happening over the last many months across the country, how would you characterize the way they do their jobs?
I think the first thing is I would say professionally. Our members attend these, and these are obviously very, they're controversial subjects right now. So our members attend, and quite often there are both sides of this there right now. There's the anti-vax people, and sometimes there's people there that are supportive, and the majority of the population of Canada obviously isn't very much in support. So these are challenging situations to attend, but I think our members have dealt with them quite professionally.
Let's just do a for instance here, Rob, and maybe you could tell us how it works. We're sitting here talking on a Monday. Let's say you find out that there's going to be an anti-vax demonstration of significance coming up, let's say this Saturday, in a jurisdiction where the RCMP are the law enforcement on the ground in that location. Okay, so you've got basically 5 days to get organized for that. What do you do?
Well, so first you have to figure out what size of a protest this might be, where it is, it depends on if it's led by a specific person, if the protest is being organized by someone specific. So there are certain times where the members will meet with the leaders of a protest, a planned protest. So I think if we step back, Canadians understand that the right to peaceful assembly is guaranteed under the Charter. So protests are generally supported. We did a poll recently in September, and most people, about 70-some%, support the idea. And the Charter, of course, guarantees the right to peaceful assembly. So the idea of the police attending these is not to shut it down, and it's just to make sure that property is protected. So the members will attend and sort of watch and see how this goes to try and make sure that it doesn't get out of hand. And so there's that fine line that needs to be balanced.
And when you say supported, let's just make sure we understand what you mean there. You don't mean necessarily politically or philosophically, you mean logistically?
Well, I mean legally, right? So the Charter, I think it's Section 2 of the Charter, guarantees the right to peaceful assembly. So the police are not there necessarily to shut down protests. Riots are a different story. Injunctions are a different story. But protests generally, the police are there to make sure that things don't get out of hand, not to determine whether it's a lawful protest. That's more of a court or a law thing. The police are there to make sure that things don't get out of hand. All
right. What if in your meetings ahead of time, the organizers of the demonstration say, you know what, we really just want to go to the legislature, we want to carry some signs, we want to do some chanting, we want to get our point across, but we have no intention of vandalizing or going anywhere. But then, as you well know, Rob, these things can take on a life of their own. And maybe somebody in the back of the demonstration says, come on, we're going to go storm the local mall. And they go and they try to gain entrance to a mall where they're not going to wear masks, they're not going to show vaccine passports, etc. How do the police handle the changing facts on the ground in that circumstance?
That is you could take that scenario and put it into thousands of calls every day. The police officers on the ground have to make a determination. to deal with each situation. So that might mean calling in more people. That might be a situation if it starts getting too unruly, where a tactical team might come in to protect people who are in need of that protection and property. So again, you really have to be nuanced, because you're never going to be outnumbering the number of people that are there protesting. So force is absolutely a very last resort. So there's nothing, ideally you set a barrier. Sometimes there's physical barriers. We've seen instances of that. So these are complicated and challenging. I'd like to give you a really quick snippet of this is exactly how you deal with it, but each time is going to be different, and each time the members there will have different levels of experience. So there's so many nuanced answers to that.
Well, you've heard this allegation against your members in the past, and I want to put it to you now so you have a chance to comment on it. You have heard the allegation that not all police officers in all police services across this country handle all protest circumstances the same. And we have heard the allegation, for example, that when it comes to, let's say, clearing homeless shelters out of a public park, the police may be a lot more direct and a lot more forceful, and at the end of the day may make many, many more arrests than they would, for example, in the case of trying to prevent anti-vax demonstrators from entering a shopping mall, the example I just gave. You've heard that allegation. Do you think there's something to it?
Well, I have heard that allegation, but I think there are probably many more aspects to that. It depends on what that group is doing. So sometimes, in the first example, each situation will be different. The people that you're moving out of a park, for example, that might be their entire, everything they own is there. And so the chance of that getting more emotional and more emotionally charged of a situation is probably higher. So, I don't know, our officers attend, millions of calls a year. And that includes, situations where you're asking people to move along. And I think they're very professional in how they do that. And sometimes there are court injunctions involved in those. So sometimes, the ability to enforce something is greater in different situations. So the park example, there might be a bylaw that says people can't be there and setting up camp during the daytime hours, versus a protest in a street, and there may not be a bylaw that says you can't be there. So there are very, very many different facets to that. But I would say on the whole, our members are very professional and deal with each situation as it comes.
No, I appreciate the nuance that you just gave in that example, but that doesn't quite, you'll forgive me, I don't think that quite gets at it, because the allegation in this case is there are many more police officers who may be in sympathy themselves with the message behind the anti-vax demonstrators, and that's why they cut them a little more slack than they would, say, the homeless people who are gathered in their tents in a public park, for whom the police, let's say, have less personal sympathy. Is that fair to say?
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think it is fair to say. I think it's fair to say. I don't agree it's so. Our police officers across Canada, and we have a rule of law in Canada, and professional police officers, and we see countries around the world where that is not the case. We don't, individual officers have individual beliefs on many, many different areas. And if that was what determined their involvement in many scenarios, that would be very challenging. They set those aside and they deal with the situation professionally. And that is a requirement. If you can't do that, then you're in the wrong occupation. So it's not about whether or not they have sympathy for someone on one side or another of the vaccination discussion. Many of our officers also feel incredibly badly and volunteer greatly with homeless shelters. And so I don't know if we can say that they're biased against, one side or another and affect their job that way.
No, I appreciate that, but let me come at it one more time in our last minute here, which is to say, it may not be the case that every police service in this country is as reflective of the population that it hopes to serve. And again, the allegation is that that many members of police services across this country, in their hearts, despite their professionalism, may be simply more simpatico with anti-vaxxers than they would be with other demonstrators that they have to deal with during the course of doing their duties. Now, again, Isn't that fair to say?
Well, I'm not sure it is. I think that is a grand discussion, and in 1 minute, I don't think we can cover it. I've worked I started in the Northwest Territories, and I've worked in many different parts of this country, as have many of our officers moved all over the country. And we have officers from all walks of life that are part of our policing community in all different organizations. And again, I come back to the professionalism with which they do their job, and I don't think it's based on where they grow up in their background as to how they do that job professionally.
Gotcha. Rob Ferrer, it's awfully good of you to join us on TVO tonight and share your views with us on this subject. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Let's get one final take on this issue, and joining us now from the nation's capital on the campus of Carleton University, there's Jeffrey Monahan. He's Associate Professor at Carleton's Institute for Criminology and Criminal Justice. And Jeffrey, it's good to have you on TVO tonight. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, Steve.
Not at all. Now, obviously, you are somebody who studies police and protest movements, and I wonder if you could help us understand from your vantage point how you would characterize how the police approach the anti-vax movement, for example, as opposed to perhaps other protest movements you see as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think what we've seen over the last couple of weeks in terms of the police response to the anti-vax movement, looking on TV and kind of seeing a lot of the responses that we've seen, I think I'd characterize it as largely disorganized. They've been behind the ball. They've mostly been trying to keep their hats on, get through events, which in contrast to the standard template of public order policing is a big contrast, right? There's a good 2 decades of professionalization around public order policing, which is all about getting ahead of the demonstrations and the protests. And what we see certainly with other movements is that police are far more organized. They have all kinds of groundwork done before the flashpoint, before you get to the specific event. And with the case of the anti-vax folks, it seems like they were completely behind the ball and unprepared.
What would you attribute the reasons for their, in your view, disorganization on this?
It's a great question, Steve. I think there's a couple of different ways that we can kind of try and answer that question. I think first and foremost, it's an organizational answer. I think when you look at police responses to movements like environmental movements, Indigenous lands defenders, Black Lives Matter, for those movements, there's all kinds of preparatory, preemptive work that goes into getting ready for those movements. They're under surveillance. There's all kinds of scrutiny. They're prepared for those movements in ways in which they've invested all kinds of organizational resources. They have liaisons. They have all kinds of leverage points in which they can understand what movements are doing. They're monitoring social media. There really is an organizational response in which these movements have been categorized as risky or threatening or disruptive in various ways. So there's all kinds of organizational resources that are invested into making sure that they can manage these movements. And with the kind of far right conspiratorial anti-vax movements in whatever kind of shape it takes, which is currently COVID and anti-vax, anti-masking kind of stuff, those groups haven't been categorized as a threat. So in some ways, maybe police have been napping on the job, or maybe they've been looking the other way. But either way, there isn't a kind of prepared approach to any of these movements.
Well, you're not ascribing motive quite, but I got a feeling you think there's a motive at play here. If so, what is it?
Well, that's a good question. I think that the easiest answer is saying they don't take these movements seriously. They don't think that there's a public order threat. They think that perhaps they'll just go away. I think there is a bigger question in which there is perhaps not a willingness to really attack or neutralize these movements. And that could be because of much bigger questions around, maybe police and the police community have shared issues of political values in which they don't really want to crack down on certain political movements, and the anti-vax movement might be one of these movements as well.
Well, let's do a little comparing and contrasting here. Maybe just take 20 seconds and tell us For those who haven't followed it, what's been going on in Fairy Creek, British Columbia, with demonstrations out there?
It's a great question, and I think it's a really timely point because we have these two major kind of movements going on, and the police response is completely different. And in Fairy Creek, what we've seen over the last, it's been really kind of building for months, but there's been mass civil disobedience. There's a very organized group of land defenders who are defying an injunction, which is maybe the major difference between these two. But nonetheless, the police response has been highly organized and highly repressive in terms of those protest movements, which of course contrasts so dramatically to what's happened with the anti-vax movements. But I would say that even perhaps a better example is if we think back about a year and a half ago to the Black Lives Matter movement, which was very, it was spontaneous, it arose quickly, it was organized by social media, it shares a lot of parallels with the anti-vax movement, the kind of COVID denier movement. But if you look back at the scenery from Black Lives Matter, police responses, they mobilized police resources. There was kind of hallways of riot police and tactical units that people had to march through. There was all kinds of very symbolic response that elicited a lot of critiques around militarization. Whereas with the anti-vax crowd, there seems to be a real reluctance to commit policing resources towards these folks.
Well, I don't want to push this comparison too far, but you certainly heard it observed that on the 6th of January in Washington, D.C., had the people who had stormed the Capitol been black instead of white, which they overwhelmingly were, you would have seen a very different conclusion to the way that turned out. Are you essentially alleging the same thing here in Canada?
I think it's a very fair comparison in some ways. And I think it's, some of this goes into the immediate task of what are we going to do in terms of policing this issue right now, but some of it also goes into this organizational task of how police decide what priorities are and decide how they're going to mobilize resources. And when it comes to white, even kind of neo-Nazi extreme movements, those movements aren't characterized with the same kind of urgency that other movements do. I would say this as well, is that I don't necessarily think that policing and over-policing and surveillance are going to solve these social problems. I do think that, when it comes to the far-right conspiratorial movements, that we have all kinds of indications that these are far more prominent and present all kinds of serious questions about what we're going to do about these things. And I don't think policing is the way that necessarily is going to solve these problems. But I do think it really is illustrative of how police organizations think about what's threatening and then mobilize resources towards different kinds of threats.
Well, okay, let me try this. I think this is a key question here, which is to say there are people who have taken very defensible, legitimate positions against mandatory vaccination, and they're out demonstrating about that in the streets, and they have constitutionally protected rights to do so. There are other people who may have different agendas. You've mentioned neo-Nazis and skinheads and white nationalists and so on, who may be exploiting that and trying to insinuate themselves into that for the purposes of a different agenda. Can you tell which of these two scenarios is prevailing at the moment?
That's a great question, Steve. And I think that so much out of the, what's grown out of this kind of social media environment of the kind of conspiracy, far right, kind of racial nationalist crowd is a real mix. And I think there's just so much there that has to do with everything from economic alienation to some concerns about civil liberties and rights. But that crowd's often been silent on other people's civil liberties. So I don't really know how much of that is like how you characterize like a legitimate political values thing or just a kind of convenient excuse to kind of mobilize. So I think it's a very dynamic social movement, but I think it's becoming more and more prominent, and it's certainly something that we're seeing right now as COVID as the issue, but we're going to be dealing with the different forms of issues for the next years and decades that come out of this mobilization.
Now, we do know one police technique over the years in order to, as you put it, get ahead of the story and be proactive as opposed to trying to play catch up, is to infiltrate various groups. Do you know whether the police are doing that as it relates to anti-vax demonstrators?
I certainly do not know, and I would be very critical of engaging in those kind of police tactics. Those are very dramatic tactics, and I'm not sure that they necessarily pay off. And I think investing in those kinds of police resources have all kinds of other repercussions. I think the way to get ahead of far right and conspiratorial movements is not necessarily to police them out of existence. I don't think that's how it's going to work. I think it actually requires a full-scale social response in terms of affirming what kind of values we want in society and education, and also trying to neutralize things like economic precarity and all kinds of other forms of strain that exacerbate these folks' anger and their kind of willingness to take things as far as they're willing to go.
And in our last 30 seconds here, Jeffrey, there are some people watching this right now who think that because this is ultimately a political thing at the end of the day, that politicians should be more hands-on in directing the police to go after anti-vax demonstrators. What's your view on that?
It's another slippery slope, Steve. I think that that's something, political officials being involved in directed policing is definitely something we've tried to buffer against in Canada. We have a fairly strong doctrine of police independence, and I definitely think that that's a good thing. So I don't think we should necessarily be advocating that the politicians should be directly involved, but I do think that politicians can do a lot more, specifically more centrist, and the kind of conservative politicians need to do a lot more with getting to these far-right communities and doing basic outreach in terms of community values, collective values, science, all kinds of stuff that they have been reluctant to do out of kind of pandering to their base. And I think they need to get ahead.
Jeffrey Monahan from Carleton University. We're glad you could spare some time for us on TVO tonight to share your views on this. Thanks so much.
Anytime. Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.